Most people think medieval warfare was all about swords, shields, and armored knights. But some of the most dangerous weapons were the ones almost nobody remembers today. In the battles of medieval Europe, one strange weapon gave ordinary foot soldiers a real chance against heavily armored cavalry. And once you see how it worked, you'll understand why it was so effective. Number 1. The weapon. The weapon in this story is the goedendag, a Flemish infantry weapon from the early 14th century. And at first glance, it looks almost too simple to matter. It was basically a thick wooden staff, broader toward the striking end, fitted with a short iron spike and reinforced with iron around the head. One surviving 14th century iron head in the Metropolitan Museum of Art measures about 23.5 centimeters, including the tang, which gives you a good sense of how compact but heavy the killing end could be. Historians still argue about the exact form, and that is part of what makes this weapon so easy to miss today. It was not a glamorous knightly sword with dozens of famous examples in museums. It was a practical battlefield tool tied to Flemish town militias, and the evidence for it comes from a mix of surviving metal heads, a few archaeological finds, and period images. Even the name sounds strange. Modern readers usually translate goedendag as good day, though the origin of the name is still debated. That strange name can make the weapon sound almost harmless, but the design was built for one thing only: stopping and finishing men at very close range. And once you place it inside the real military world of medieval Flanders, the whole logic becomes clear. Because this was not a weapon made for single combat, tournament display, or noble status. It was made for dense infantry fighting, for men standing shoulder to shoulder, and for the moment when an armored enemy got close enough that reach, weight, and a hard thrust mattered more than elegance. Number 2. The men. That leads straight to the people who carried it. The goedendag belonged to the world of Flemish urban militias, not to the classic image of the lone knight on horseback. Around 1302, the rebel forces in Flanders were made up largely of town militias, and in the broader military system of the Low Countries, armies could combine noble cavalry, urban militias, and fighters from the countryside. So, when people imagine the Battle of the Golden Spurs as a mob of desperate peasants with improvised clubs, that picture misses the point. Many of these men were artisans, guild members, townsmen, and locally organized fighters who came out of rich commercial centers and civic politics. They were not full-time professionals in the way French men-at-arms were, but they were also not random civilians pulled into battle with no structure. The Flemish forces were formed in major divisions under their own leaders, with contingents from places like Bruges, the Bruges Franc, East Flanders, Ypres, and men linked to Ghent appearing in the campaign. Later writers linked the victory to the rising political power of guilds, especially the weavers, which tells you how deeply war and urban society were connected. In that setting, the goedendag makes perfect sense. It does not look like a refined aristocratic weapon because it was not supposed to. A militia weapon had to be durable, direct, and effective in formation. It had to work in the hands of men fighting on foot in close order alongside pikes, spears, and crossbows rather than tournament lances. It also had to fit a battlefield where cavalry still carried enormous prestige, because that is exactly what the goedendag was built to challenge. It was a weapon from a society where wealthy towns could put disciplined infantry in the field and expect them to stand their ground against mounted elites. Number 3. How it worked. What made the goedendag so nasty was not that it was magical or technologically advanced. It was nasty because it combined a heavy shock weapon with a thrusting point in a form that worked well at close quarters. A contemporary description linked to Guillaume Guillard explains the basic idea very clearly. He describes long, heavy, iron-mounted staffs made to be used with two hands, able to deliver a crushing blow and then quickly come back forward with a projecting iron point to stab. That tells you two things right away. First, this was not just a blunt club. Second, it was not simply a short spear either. It lived in the gap between the two. The best way to understand it is as a brutal hybrid. Archaeological finds described by researchers match that general picture. A heavy, steel-mounted club section with a ferrule and pointed head, built more for force and control than for elegant fencing. In formation, men with longer pikes or spears could help break the momentum of a cavalry charge, while the shorter, heavier goedendag became especially dangerous once the line compressed and the horsemen lost speed. A rider slowed by ditches, marshy ground, other infantry, or a wounded horse was suddenly within range of a two-handed weapon that could smash, shove, and thrust into weaker points. That does not mean it punched through the best armor like a fantasy weapon. In 1302, many vulnerable targets still existed: horses, limbs, faces, gaps, and fallen men. And that is the detail people often miss about medieval combat. A weapon did not need to cut clean through a breastplate to decide a fight. It only needed to ruin balance, break momentum, injure the mount, or open one fatal chance in the chaos of a packed infantry line. In that sense, the goedendag was less about dueling skill and more about raw force delivered at exactly the right distance. Number 4. The battle. Now put that weapon into the most famous moment of its history, the Battle of the Golden Spurs, fought near Kortrijk on July 11, 1302. A French force built around elite cavalry expected to crush a Flemish rebel army. Instead, the Flemish infantry militia held ground that made a rapid mounted assault much harder. Contemporary and later accounts describe a battlefield shaped by streams, moats, ditches, and broken ground, exactly the kind of terrain that steals speed from horses and turns a proud charge into a mess. That part matters because the goedendag was not a miracle stick that beat knights by itself. It was one piece of a system. Terrain slowed the attack. Infantry formations held. Pikes and spears threatened the front. Then, weapons like the goedendag became deadly in the close fight that followed, especially once horses were checked and riders started losing cohesion. The result was a shock to the military imagination of Europe. The Flemish defeated a professional mounted force, and the battle took its name from the spurs collected from the fallen enemy. Later tradition fixed the number at around 500 pairs, preserved as trophies in a local church. What makes the story even more important is that the weapon appears in period depictions of the battle and in later discussions about how the Flemish infantry actually fought. So the goedendag is not just a legend attached to a famous victory after the fact. It sits right inside the battle's memory as a specifically Flemish answer to knightly warfare. And the deeper point is that the men using it were not trying to imitate knights. They were fighting as infantry from the start, relying on ground, discipline, and formation, and their weapon reflected that choice perfectly. The insane part is not just the shape of the weapon. It is the fact that a tool this plain helped expose how vulnerable cavalry could become once its speed and spacing were gone. Number 5. The shockwave. Once that victory happened, the effect went far beyond one field in Flanders.
Encyclopedia Britannica describes the battle as an early beginning of the 14th century infantry revolution, and it notes that the Scots at Bannockburn consciously copied the Flemings. The same source also links the victory to a generation of political ascendancy for the Weavers' Guild in the urban centres. That does not mean one weird weapon suddenly changed all of Europe overnight. Cavalry remained powerful, nobles still mattered, and later medieval armies continued to mix mounted and foot troops in different ways. But Courtrai proved something that many people in that world did not want to believe. Disciplined infantry, fighting on chosen ground and using the right formations and weapons, could beat the social and military elite of mounted warfare. The goedendag became a symbol of that lesson because it captured the whole reversal in one object. Knights usually represented status, money, armor, horses, lineage, and military prestige. The goedendag represented organized towns, guild muscle, practical design, and the killing efficiency of men on foot. It also showed that military effectiveness was not always about owning the most prestigious weapon. Sometimes it was about having the right one for the exact tactical problem in front of you. That is why the weapon matters historically, even if it never spread across Europe as the universal weapon of the age. It belongs to a turning point when the battlefield started to reward discipline, cohesion, and planned infantry tactics in a more visible way. In other words, the goedendag matters not because it was elegant, but because it exposed a weakness in the knight-centered system that had dominated so much medieval warfare. It turned the confidence of mounted elites against them and helped make infantry look far more dangerous than many nobles had expected. Number 6. Why it vanished. And that is probably the biggest reason most people have never heard of it. The goedendag was highly specific.
It was tied to Flemish warfare, to urban militias, and to a fairly narrow historical setting. Researchers have pointed out that both the finds and the images are scarce, which suggests the weapon was used for a limited period in a limited area and never became widely popular outside that context. On top of that, even specialists have argued for generations over what exactly counts as a goedendag and how it should be separated from related spiked staffs or other pole weapons. Once a weapon has a debated shape, a strange name, few surviving examples, and no long international career, it has a hard time surviving in popular memory. Popular culture usually prefers the clean silhouettes of longswords, halberds, maces, and bows. The goedendag sits in an awkward category in between, too plain to be romanticized, and too regionally specific to become a universal icon. But historically, that is exactly why it is so interesting. It opens a window into the real texture of medieval European warfare, where towns could raise serious infantry, where guild politics and military force could overlap, and where the deadliest answer to an armored rider was sometimes not a famous knightly blade at all, but a hard piece of wood with iron on the end, held in two hands by a man standing firm in line with his city behind him. Even today, the Battle of the Golden Spurs Museum experience in Kortrijk still asks visitors what a goedendag actually looked like, which tells you that the mystery around this weapon never fully went away.